Hello, hello, hello. This is AJT500 slash Talented Track 98 slash Heloise Wonderwise slash Hilo, and this video is going to be very rambly, very rambly. This one has no notepad, no script, no nothing. I just kind of want to talk because I was talking to myself when I got home, and when I was at work today, and then leaving the gym, and I was just thinking about Hexa, dude. I was thinking about Hexa, and the reason why I've been thinking about Hexa, I'm a very YouTube oriented person when it comes to Grand Blue. I look at a lot of people's like content. I'm like when it comes to like my crew chat, I'm one of the people that spams like every channel with like every single time I see a video with like an updated grid from somebody, I post that joint. It doesn't matter the Ellie. I just like seeing different setups for, you know, different Ellies and seeing how people do stuff. And since Horus has come out and Sandolphin and people have started using Summer Serial more, and pretty much since Light has gotten buffed a lot more when it comes to high level content, I've seen a lot of people doing Light stuff for high level content, right? And I've been seeing a lot of Light in Hexa and in Fall. And when I look at the Hexa stuff, I'm like, this looks really cheeky and cool. Like, if you guys didn't know, there have been people that have been out there soloing Hexa now on Light, which is crazy because for the longest time nobody could solo it, and then it was like only water, and now, you know, wind and light can solo it now too. So there's just been a lot of buzz about Light in these harder fights, but Hexa has been coming up a lot because, like I said, people have been soloing it, and people have just been playing around and having fun with the buff Light. I haven't actually been in there yet, but I've been kind of wanting to. It's just that I've said in a couple videos now, the only thing I really do on this game is farm bars, so I'm kind of strapped to just seeking the bar raids right now. I do need to take a break and just like have some fun with some of the raids, but you know, I was thinking about Hexa, and you know, I was thinking about, like, you know, Hexa was a really freaking cool fight. Like, it was a really cool fight. And I don't know if this is a hot take or if it's a controversial take or whatever, but in my opinion, when I think about it, I think Hexa unironically might be the best fight in the game right now. Like, unironically. And I just kind of want to go through Hexa, and I have tabs up here for like all the raids, and I'm going to kind of compare and contrast them and talk about just my thoughts on them, but mostly focusing on Hexa because I feel like Hexa has like a different aura to it than the other raids, right? And I just want to talk about that. So that's what we're going to do today. And like I said, this is going to be very off the cuff. I'm just talking, you know, I'm just talking to talk because I just want to talk about it. So the first thing, before I even get over to the tabs, aesthetics presentation of the raids, right? First of all, Super Ultimate Bahamut, we have seen so many Bahamuts. So many different iterations of Bahamuts, and like Bahamut is obviously a very big part of Grand Blue Fantasy. I understand it's the first, it was the first Super Ultimate raid, you know, but we've seen Bahamut over and over and over again, right? Fall, we've seen Fosson, you know, Fall for the longest time, and probably even to this you know, to this day, you know, what makes the sky blue, like that series of, you know, stories for that event, you know, not only are they very important for the story in general, but they're a lot of people's favorites, you know, and that kind of set the, I wouldn't say like that. Obviously, we still have the main story of Grand Blue, but in a way, the fight versus like Fosson and Belial and like Bubs is kind of in its way almost like a secondary main story for Grand Blue. You know, like all that stuff, and with like all the Primarchs and Sandolphin and everything that goes on, and what makes the sky blue is very pivotal to Grand Blue as a whole. Like I said, it's pretty much like a secondary main story in a way. So it's very big, and I understand the appeal to Fosson. Personally, I've never really been that big on Fosson. Like, he's kind of cool, but I've never super been like ecstatic about Fosson. But then we get to the 6 dragons, right? And I think the six dragons are really cool. You know, I have Fediel up on the screen now. You guys know I love Fediel. I love Shrieking Galleon too. I love Willness. Willness is my Shrieking dude. I love Willness. I like all of them, to be honest. I think they're all cool in their way. I mean, some of them I like less than others, but I mean, I like all the six dragons, and the fact that, you know, we've kind of gotten to, you know, meet and interact, and obviously the dragons join the crew, you know, in their side stories or whatever, but you know, they're allies at this point. You know, there's like this connection with the six dragons in a way that I feel like you don't, like, you kind of get to see like how Fosson thinks, and like, you know, stuff in the past with Fosson and how he operates, stuff like that, and we saw like his side of the story. But you know, it's like we don't have as much of a connection with Fosson, or especially Super Ultimate Bahamut, or Super Ultimate Bahamut, he's just a big dragon essentially. Like, we know, you know, some lore and stuff, but it's like, you know, he's just kind of like a living legend, I guess, you know, type thing. But the six dragons, there's kind of like this bond, you know, so it's like you kind of already know about the six dragons, right? So just the six dragons, aesthetically, I really like dragons in general. So the six dragons, just knowing the six dragons and the aesthetic of the six dragons is really cool. Also the music. The music is really freaking cool, because the thing about the music is the music has like, it has essentially 4 tracks, right? It has, you know, remixed tracks of, you know, each, so pretty much each dragon, you know, Willness and Elwiar, they have like a rearranged track. Then Galleon and Womdus have a rearranged track. Then Luo and Fediel have a rearranged track. And then you have like the combined Hexachromatic Hierarch track at the end. And it's like, you have like all this different music. And it's like, of course, you know, in Super Ultimate Bahamut, in Fall Zero, they have like iterations of their music, and then it gets like more epic as the fight goes on and stuff. But it's like this constant swapping of music in Hexa is really cool to me. And another thing, I'm gonna get into this a little bit later when I talk about you know, how the fight works and stuff, but the fact that that music can also be random, it switches up depending on how you go into the fight, is really cool to me. You know, it's just, I don't know, aesthetically and musically, Hexa is really cool to me. As opposed to, I mean, the other two are cool as well, don't get me wrong, but it's just Hexa has, like I said, it has a certain aura to it that I feel like the other two don't have as much. So yeah, I just think Hexa is really cool when it comes to just being a boss, right? So let's talk now that we kind of gotten past like the aesthetics and stuff, let's talk about like some of the mechanics, right? And the reason why I feel like I kind of actually want to start with progression, right? And this might be kind of weird, and some people may not have been around for some of these fights as they came out, but I was around for all of these fights as they came out. When Super Ultimate Bahamut came out, I was a little bit slower on that raid than I was on Hexa and Fall, where Hexa and Fall I was like there day one, whereas Super Ultimate Bahamut I was there day one, but I was kind of more like a bystander. I was kind of just watching people do stuff, and then I kind of like followed suit afterwards. But like Hexa and Fall, I was like there, I was in it, you know. So I'm going to talk about just like kind of progression when it comes to those raids, because I was there in a sense for all three, right? So I feel like the progression when it came to Hexa was also very different, and this is where I'm going to talk about some of the mechanics as well. The cheeking randomness of Hexa is so different. It's a whole different mindset, and it almost feels like if people have played, I've talked in the past, I do like, you know, pseudo world prog type stuff for Final Fantasy 14. You know, I do like all the ultimate raids in that game. Hexa felt like I was progging an ultimate raid. Obviously, it's not as in depth as a Final Fantasy 14 ultimate raid, but the mindset when I was progressing through that fight felt there as opposed to the other ones. You know, like I noted when I talked about Fall Zero in my Earth like explanation video, I talked about how that for me Fosson had been spreadsheeted for Earth, very fast, right? Because the main thing is like you just do the 30 mil damage at the start, which can be difficult, especially when people were first getting into it. But then it's like 30 mil, and then like the triple attack trigger, the CA damage trigger, the skill damage trigger, right? But like that always happens the exact same way. It always happens the exact same way. And then like Super Ultimate Bahamut kind of has some variants where Super Ultimate Bahamut has like, you know, the different triggers it'll do on like turn 6 or whatever, right? But the thing with Super Ultimate Bahamut is some of your triggers, most of his triggers, you can kind of just run through. Even at the start, you could kind of run through. Like, I remember back then, when I was playing Earth in that raid, like, you would play Kengo, and you would literally just ignore everything. You would just literally go through everything. You would just OG through everything. It didn't matter which one he was. For the longest time, I didn't even know how his, like, phase 1 of Super Ultimate Bahamut even worked, because you would just steamroll through it. And this was like on release. You know, obviously I think some other Ellies had more difficulties, but you know, as Earth, I was like, this is kind of whatever. You know what I'm saying? I was just kind of doing whatever, right? But then you get to Hexa, and it's like, you come in and it's like the thing I was talking to myself about, I'm crazy, by the way, so I talk to myself all the time, but I was talking to myself and I was like, you know, the crazy thing about Hexa is, I know, for example, like, I brought up Light at the start of this, right? And a lot of the early progression that I did on that fight, I did do a lot of it on Earth, but I also played a lot of Light. I've mentioned this before, but I played a lot of Light because a lot of people didn't want to play Light when Hexa first came out, right? So I played a lot of Light just because there were rooms available and they took Light, and I had a pretty decent Light. So I was playing Light, and it's like, when I look back at Light, I'm like, you know, pretty much everybody, it's pretty infamous at this point that a lot of Ellies really don't like Fedial and Luo phase, right? A lot of Ellies don't like that phase. It can be very difficult to survive on a lot of Ellies in that phase, right? And it's like Light had that same issue too. And it's like, when you look at an Ellie like Light back then, when you come in the start of Hexa, it's like, okay, you may start the fight with, you know, Womdis and Galleon, right? And it's like you're playing Light, and it's like, okay, this is fine. And then you get to, like, you know, the next phase change, and it's like, it's Fedial Luo, and it's like, well, this is okay. I kind of had an easy Galleon Womdis at the start. You know, I see that Fedial Luo, like, someone else pushed the boss. I see Fedial Luo's back. I'm sitting on, like, you know, 6 Ogies right now. I just Ogie into it. I clear my shield right off the bat, and it's like, okay, this is pretty easy, right? I've had some build up. I've had some time to get my uni stacks up. I might even have uni S4 up by the time I get to Fedial Luo, and it's like a lot easier to progress through it, right? But then you have other instances where you go into Hexa and you're trying to progress the fight, and you get Fedial Luo first. You get Fedial Luo first, and now it's like, oh snap. How the heck do I deal with this? I'm sitting on 0 uni stacks. My Cosmos needs a few turns to get her S3 up. You know, do I sack a character here? I don't know. You know, I don't have like any buffs. I'm struggling. I don't have like a ton of heals. You know, I haven't really gotten rolling yet. But the thing about it too is, the reason why I bring up Light specifically, right? It's kind of a Light and Dark thing. But Light specifically, if you get Fedial Luo first, Fedial Luo, that's your shield, buddy. That's your shield. You can't just sit there, you know? In Hexa, you can't just sit there. You have to do this. You have to do the shield, because even back then, when people really relied on the wind and the water player to carry that raid, they need you to break the shield so they can carry. So you gotta move. You gotta do something as the Light player in that. And it's just like, it's a very different experience to a fight like Foson, where it's like, you know, no one's really counting on me per se until like 20. You know what I'm saying? No one really cares what I'm doing. Obviously, they need you to move, right? But no one really cares what I'm doing until you hit 20%, right? Super Ultimate Bahamut, I would wager no one really cares what you're doing in general. As long as the 10% person is alive and kicking, no one really cares what you're doing, right? But Hexa, someone's gonna care what you're doing in one of those phases. And if it's the start of the fight, they really care what you're doing because you have to be the one to push the fight. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, it's a very different mindset when it comes to Hexa as opposed to the other raids, because there's randomness to it. And that's another thing where I think this fight is literally built differently than the other two. And I was trying to think about, why does this one feel so different? And I think one of the main reasons why is because the Draconics are less important weapons than your Ultimas and your Opuses. I think because your Opuses and your Ultimas are much more important weapons on a day-to-day basis than your Draconics, they felt the need that they could push Hexa just a little bit more than the other two raids. Right? I would even wager, I've mentioned in the past how I don't really like Fa has randomness in the sense that he'll do 2 dispels or 7 debuffs, but he'll just spam those for like half the fight. He'll spam those for like half the fight, and I'm like, this is really freaking easy. But then I think about it and I'm like, okay, not only is Opus really important, but you have to clear Fosson on every single Ellie if you want to get your tidings. You don't have to do that on Hexa. You can clear 500 Hexas on one Ellie and get all your Draconics done. And then you look at Super Ultimate Bahamut and it's like, okay, well, you don't have to clear on every Ellie for Super Ultimate Bahamut, but Super Ultimate Bahamut has some leniency too, because Super Ultimate Bahamut was the first Super Ultimate raid. So they kind of had to test the waters with what they could push in that raid. But Hexa, they had already done it once with Super Ultimate Bahamut, and the rewards are less important than the other two. So they felt the need, in my opinion, I think they felt the need or the desire to push Hexa a little bit harder in difficulty than the other two, to do a little bit more with that raid than the other two, because they felt you can do this on any Ellie, and you can do it as many times as you want on any Ellie, and the reward kind of matters less. And going back to the Final Fantasy example, it's kind of the same thing with Ultimates, where Ultimates, yes, the weapon when it comes out is technically best in slot, but it's only like one materia slot best in slot in Final Fantasy, right? Besides that, ultimate weapons are essentially just there for aesthetics, and to get the title and say, hey, I did this, right? So they could feel the desire to push ultimates harder in that game, because there's no reason that you have to do an ultimate, right? You don't have to do an ultimate to progress the game or anything. In the same way where Hexa, of course, Draconics are strong, but they're not like make or break. You have to have Draconic or you're just massively stunted. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, again, Hexa just is built different. It's built different. It has an aura that the other fights just don't have, in my opinion. Okay, so let me think what else does Hexa have? So I talked about the randomness, right? See, and that's another thing too. The randomness is also really a big thing, because that's another thing that tells me as an onlooker of their development process that this fight again was built differently, because they could have easily just made it so that it's always like Wilness Eliar, then Galleon Wamnus, then Fediel Luo. They could have easily done that. And that's just how the fight works. The fight wouldn't have been like that much different if it was like that. But they said, nah, we want to do this random. And they felt that they could do it random. And I think it works well random. I think it's really cool that it's random. I think it's cool like that. It's not like too overbearing, in my opinion, but it gives you a decent challenge, especially when you're first getting into Hexa, and especially when it first came out, it was a decent challenge. I know back then a lot of times, I remember for Hexa, I hung around DYDK's Twitch on Twitch chat a lot when that fight first came out. And I remember a lot of times, he plays Wind. If you guys don't know him, go check him out on YouTube and Twitch, by the way. But a lot of times he played Wind. So like I said before, Wind and Water were like main carries. And he would tell people that he was playing with, people that were learning the raid, just get your shield done. Just get your shield done. Like, just worry about your shield. That's it. That's it. That's all you got to do. Just worry about your shield. But that was a struggle for some people. You know what I'm saying? That was a struggle. So it's just like, because like I said, the randomness of when that stuff happens can be difficult for some Ellies. Or at least it was difficult for some Ellies when it first came out. So it's just, I don't know. It like I said, the fact that they felt that they were free enough to make that random when they could have easily just made it stagnant is like really interesting to me, because there's not really another fight that does stuff like that. Like I said, Super Ultimate Bahamut, it'll do like random triggers and stuff, but it'll do random triggers and stuff, and then Fosson will do random triggers and stuff. But Hexa has random phases. It's just like, you just gotta deal with that stuff. It's crazy. Okay, so what else do I want to talk about? I guess let's talk about like the big challenge of these fights. Like I guess it's not necessarily the big challenge, but it's like one of the defining mechanics of this fight. And what I mean by this is I would say like the last 10% of Super Ultimate Bahamut is a big challenge of the fight. Hexa, the big challenge is like the what is it, 18 I have the page up. 18 triple attacks and 18 Ogies. Where's this? I didn't even talk about 40%. Oh god. Okay. So, I didn't talk about this either. Maybe I should have had this page up. Okay. So another thing. Let me before I get down to 40. Let me talk about this. The dragon level, like the power level, right? This is not in either one of these raids. This is something that happens at the start of the fight, and it carries through until 40%, and then post 40%, it still affects you. No other fight has this. Where you have to manage your stacks throughout the fight. You have to manage your stacks throughout the fight so that once 40 hits, the amount of stacks will hinder you depending on how many you have. Because look, we'll go down to 40%, right? So essentially, if you guys have never done Hexa, by the way, essentially what these are is each dragon will have its own. Oh god, that's something else too. Oh, okay. So let's look at these. Jeez, see, there's so much stuff. There's so much stuff in Hexa. So each dragon will have these, right? They will have like their own stacks of dragon energy, and depending on how high these stacks are, they will boost the boss in general stats, right? They will boost the boss in general stats. The way that pretty much these stacks will go up whenever you fail an omen, or they have a potential to just randomly go up at the end of the turn, right? But each dragon has like its own unique one. So like Wellness right here has attack boosted, LER has hit counts boosted, Womdus has damage cut, so they take less damage. Galleon has higher defense, so they take less damage again. Luo has a chance to attack twice each turn. Fadiel has a chance to apply various debuffs. This is these are the reasons why people hate Fadiel and Luo, by the way, all these freaking debuffs, right? So like, not only do each dragon have their own unique buff that you have to manage, when you swap phases, once you swap phases, whatever stacks are remaining at the end of the phase will go into like this like universal dragon stack right here, right? It'll go into this universal dragon stack. So let's say you have like 2 Wellness and you have 3 LER, right? If you swap then to Womdus and Galleon next, Womdus and Galleon will then start to have their own stacks, but these 5 stacks you had will turn into this universal dragon energy stack, right? So now technically if Womdus and Galleon start here, they're gonna eventually transition into this too. So at this point you're already bare minimum stuck at like 7 stacks. Right? But I guess bare minimum you're stuck at 5, because you could lower these to 0 to completely take them off, right? But you're at bare minimum 5 stacks, and these will carry over, this dragon energy will carry over all the way until 40, where it will transition. Not only will it'll give these buffs to Hexa at 40%, depending on how many buffs total you have once you get to 40%, right? So not only is that a thing, but then this buff will also transition into this buff. And what this buff does is post 40%, he will essentially keep all the stacks he had. So let's say you go into 40% and you have 10 stacks, right? Not only will he have he will have all these buffs, right? He'll have all these buffs because you had 10, but then he'll have 10 of this buff. And then depending on if you use six buttons, it doesn't matter what type of button they are, it doesn't matter how many turns have gone over, they will build up more stacks. This is a lot to explain, huh? That it will build up more stacks, which will then skill lock you and do 20k plane damage to your entire party once you hit 6 buttons hit. So what do I mean by this? Okay, let me try to explain this a little bit better. So let's say you have 10 stacks of this, right? If you press a button, you'll get 1 stack of this, right? And then if you press 6 buttons, it will so this will stack up to, it'll stack up to 5, and then the 6th button press that you hit will reset it to 0. But then that's when you get skill locked, and then the 20k damage comes out, right? And then this, once you hit that 6th button, this will go to 0, this top one will go to 0, but this bottom one will then go down 1 stack. So if you had 10 stacks going in, you will then, once you use 6 buttons, this will go down to 9 stacks, and then the process repeats. So then when you hit 6 buttons again, you know, this will go down to 0 again, and then this will go down to 8 next, right? So the point of all this, what I'm trying to get at here, the point of all this is you want to cancel as many, I would say, high priority omens, because the thing about it is each dragon has a specific omen that is specific to them. So for example, Wellness has what is it, the charge attack one? Yeah, this one. So he has the charge attack one. So depending on how much, I think it's how much skill damage you do or something like that. How much skill damage you do, well, okay, no, this one, okay, so depending on how much CA damage you do, wellnesses will come up, and you have to do 36 hits to cancel it, right? And then if you do a ton of skill damage, LERs will come up, and you have to charge attack 5 times, right? So the thing about it is you want to aim for these, because they do, all the dragons, all the phases of the dragons have like this standard like 20 mil damage trigger, right? And this one will lower stacks, but it doesn't lower stacks as much as if you did like these high priority specific dragon ones, right? So you want to not only get these triggers, but then cancel these specific triggers so that you can keep your stacks low, so that not only you can avoid these stacks at the end, so you can avoid like all this extra stuff that he'll get buffing wise, but you can also avoid these stacks at the end, because you drop all your dragon levels as low as possible, so that you can be, so that you don't have to go through this pony and dance show that I talked about before, where you have to lower these stacks, and then eventually you can use skills freely, right, at the end. So essentially, if you can get all these stacks off, you can freely use skills at that point. You're no longer restricted. But the thing about it is, if you go into this phase with like 10 stacks, you're probably not going to get all those 10 stacks off, because you're going to be remember, it does 20k plane damage to your entire party every time you do that 6th skill, right? So it's just like, that's a lot of damage to take 10 times. You know what I'm saying? Obviously you don't have to take them in a row, but it's just like, that's a lot of damage, right? So you're probably not going to get all that off if you go in with like 10 stacks. You know what I'm saying? So the objective is to keep your stacks low, so that you can freely use skills without dying at the end, right? But all that is to say, all that stuff I just talked about, no other fight has that. No other fight has stacks that play into whatever you do at the start plays into what happens at the end, right? So it's like, if for fall 0, right? It doesn't matter if you know how you clear a trigger, or like, you know, if I cleared 10 dispel 2-time triggers throughout the fight, you know, my labor at the end comes up like this or something. Maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe it's not actually random. Who knows? But you know what I'm saying? But for the most part, that doesn't really matter, even if it isn't random, right? But no other fight has something like that. Super Ultimate Bahamut doesn't have something like that, where you carry it through the entire fight, and then you have to deal with what you carried, however you performed in the fight. Depends how easy or hard you're going to have it at the end. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, and it's not like the end is a pushover either. You have to deal with 40%. 40% is quite a bit. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's a lot. You know, but no other fight has this. No other fight has this. And this is the type of thing I'm saying where Hexa is built different. I feel like they really pushed Hexa as opposed to the other fights. They really want to do something like unique and cool with Hexa as opposed to the other two raids. You know what I'm saying? And it's just really, really interesting, right? It's really interesting. Okay, so let's go look at what I was originally going to see. This is how in-depth Hexa is, that I had to like go back and explain all this other stuff before I could even get to what I wanted to talk about, right? So what I was trying to get to before was I was talking about like the big moves of these fights. So like, in my opinion, Super Ultimate Bahamut's big one is like 10%, where it's like you have to do something like special to deal with 10%, right? Hexa's big one is 40%, right? And then Faw's is 20%, where you have to deal with the labors, right? I guess Faw kind of has two, where you have to deal with the 60%, but 60% for Faw, well, I guess technically it's 55%, but 55% is kind of like, it's kind of like the inverse of Hexa, right? Where Hexa has that at 15%, Fawson has it at 55%. And even that, now that I think about it, even that, the fact that Fawson's is so early, right? Fawson's is so early, and like all that, I would say that is much harder than post 20% for Fawson, right? I feel like most people would probably agree that trying to set up and deal with that is probably harder than just, you know, using 000 or 99 mil damage and then using like Quillen to do 99 hits, right? I feel like that's probably easier, right? But if you look at Fawson has that harder thing in the middle at 55%, right? Hexa has that at the very end. That's the climax of the fight. Is that big gauntlet, 15% to the end, right? And remember, not only does Hexa have this at the end, but it also has all the stuff I just talked about. So he has all these buffs that you might be dealing with, all the damage you've taken up to 15%, and you have to potentially, if you still have stacks, you know, these stacks, you still have to deal with the inability to use as many skills per turn as you actually may want to, right? So it's like that's the type of difficulty that I'm looking at when it comes to these raids, right? And then if you look at like Super Ultimate Bahamut, right, 10% is its big move, but pretty much from when Super Ultimate Bahamut was first beaten, it's always been a thing of, we're just gonna use, one guy's gonna stay behind at 50%, you know, and they're just gonna do the 10% by themselves, right? So it's like you kind of take that team interaction out of the hardest part of the fight, you know, getting past that 10% and then finishing out the boss. You kind of take that out because someone just does it by themselves, right? So it's just like, not only is Fawson's ending easier, not only is Super Ultimate Bahamut's like the easiest because only one person even really has to do that, but Hexa has all this stuff going on at the very end. You know what I'm saying? It's crazy. It's crazy how much different, you know, of an atmosphere that the endings of those fights have. Also, by the way, I don't even know how I got on that tangent. Cheeking. I was trying to talk about 40%. I keep talking about other stuff. Okay, so 40% for this. So a big thing, a big thing for 40% with Hexa. Hexa can straight up wipe you. Team wipe, dude. Team wipe. Like no other. Okay, Fawson kind of has this at the start, right? It kind of has it at the start with the 30 mil. But again, this is at the start. It's at the very start of the fight. You can get an insta wipe, somebody can die, somebody doesn't. You know, one guy doesn't get his 30 mil off, and he puts up the sorry sticker, and it's like, okay, well, the raid's over. At least we only took like 2 turns, you know what I'm saying? Super Ultimate Bahamut, I would say, you know, it's kind of annoying when the 10% guy doesn't, you know, finish the job at the end, but it is all on one guy, so it you know, it's kind of understandable, you know, but Hexa is at 40%. It's just a little bit under halfway through the fight. And now you have to deal with a potential team wipe. And the thing about this team wipe is straight up, some Ellies can't deal with this. Some Ellie, and this is one thing that I also want to mention too, is that Hexa, I feel like, was the start of a very summon based super ultimate meta, right? Where at the time, obviously Fa Zero wasn't out yet. There was only Super Ultimate Bahamut before Hexa. Obviously summons were important in Super Ultimate Bahamut, but I feel like once you got to Hexa, summons became incredibly important. People were using, you know, people needed Lucifer maxed out so that people could survive. People needed Lucifer to survive. They needed the HP. People were running Bahamuts like crazy just to speed up their Lucifers so they could survive. You know, you saw stuff like Yatima coming out. Yatima so that you could speed up your character's cooldowns so that you could use multiple summons. You know, it played big time into Yatima's release, where Yatima saw a lot of use in Hexa because you needed to use these summons. Heck, the 2 mil hit triggers 50% through each phase. A lot of Ellies will just use double summons bare minimum just to help with those 2 mil hits because they can't cover it with just their characters. You know what I'm saying? So you saw like this big meta shift in terms of these super ultimate raids where summons all of a sudden became very important. Very important. And I'm actually leading to 40% with this one. I'm not just rambling. This time, what I'm trying to get at is 40% straight up at the start. Ellies you needed to have Alexiel. Even to this day, some Ellies need to have either Alexiel, or they need to cross an Alexiel, or they need Gojo summon in order to survive. 40% is literally either you take no damage or you get one-shotted. There is no recourse. There is no canceling this trigger. You have to deal with it. You have to deal with that. And it's just like, what the heck? You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, wow. You know, that was very, and even then, even if you look at Foson now, it's like people, you know, people stop at like 60% and people throw up their OK stickers and stuff for that. And people stop at 20% and people put up their OK stickers for that. But that is more so that people can cancel triggers and so that people don't run into stuff when there's no debuffs. 40% on Hexa. It's a little bit more than taking it with no debuffs, because if you push a little bit fast on Hexa, see, the thing about Hexa is Hexa gains these pearls once you go to 40%, right? And essentially what this does is this makes Hexa do a ton of damage. Not only does it do a ton of damage, but it does like all the element damage, right? So if you push 40 too fast and somebody runs into this mess, they're dead. You know, somebody runs into no debuffs on Fa, they might go down to like red HP. They may potentially lose a character if they were fairly low going in. You run into 40% unprepared on Hexa, you're dead, bro. You're dead. It's just like, oh my lord. And the thing about it too is Hexa is also very important for 40% because some people need cooldowns in order to take this. You know, for example, Wind uses like Charlotta's, like unchallenged, right? To go through. You may need that unchallenged up so that you can go through this. You know, Fire is another good example. Fire is a better example because the thing with Fire is a lot of Fire players will use Percival's S2, but not only will they get screwed if Percival's S2 is not up, but if they don't put up Percival's S2, these pearls, like all this, I think it's this one, yeah, the auroral curtain, this makes it so that essentially debuffs don't land. Like it's very hard for them to land. Like extremely, ridiculously hard, if even possible, right? So if someone pushes this early before the fire player can put up Percival's thing, they're not putting up Percival's thing. And what did I say before? If you come into 40% unprepared, if you don't have Percival's thing up, you're dead. It's over. Fight over. You're done. You know, you can't get past this 40%. It will just straight up wipe you. You know what I'm saying? But like I said, I feel like some of the other fights aren't like that, where it's just like they don't have the same raid wipe mechanic as the 40% in Hexa. But like Fa has the labors, obviously. But the thing about labors is not only now do we have 000 so that you can reset the labors and you can pick another one essentially, but I've seen people just straight up tank a labor. You know, I've seen people like dark players. I've seen dark players just tank a labor. They'll guard all and then they'll get another one so that they can do the next one, right? Or I've seen fire players, they'll just tank one with finning now, and it's just like they just go through it. You can't tank 40%. Well, technically you can tank 40%. You can do like an all ally sub. You can do that. So I guess that does give you some leeway, but not all characters have all ally subs that you may be bringing for this fight. So it's just like, yeah, it's kind of crazy. Another big thing too is this is what I was trying to get back to a while ago, was the six dragons trial. Like, this is a big thing, right? Where the six dragons trial, I don't know where the info is for this thing. Oh, here it is. Okay, so yeah, I was right. Deal 18 triple attacks or 18 charge attacks, right? At the time, this was kind of daunting. You know, a lot of people had to use like Yamato S1 to make sure. Some people may still have to use Yamato S1 to make sure they can make it through this trigger, right? So this is quite a bit. Yeah, obviously you have 6 turns to do this. You don't have to do it in 1 turn, but you have 6 turns to do this. But this is still kind of daunting. You know what I'm saying? And another thing is, this was like, I think this was the first mechanic that was this important that you couldn't just cancel it out. You can't just C-splitter this. You can't just Uni S3 this. If you do that, your Pearl does not come off, and if your Pearl does not come off, the fight becomes nigh unkillable. It becomes way harder to kill when Pearls are up, because again, like I said before, when the Pearls are up, they do more of that damage, and it's just like, that can be, it's raid wipey for a lot of Ellies, right? So it's just like, no. So having to deal with this was pretty big at the time. It was pretty big. You know, this is quite steep to have to do that many triple attacks or charge attacks. So it's just like, man. And I just feel like, and see, even this, and the thing about this too, Hexa will get you, because I don't know where it's listed here, but pretty much the more turns that, oh, here it is. Lowers all HP and applies random debuffs at the end of the turn. So the more turns you take to clear this, the more debuffed you're getting. And these are permanent, by the way. Whatever these debuffs and the lower HP, these are permanent for the rest of the fight. So the longer you take to clear this, the more debuffed you're going to be. Foson is literally, you clear your one thing, you're done. You're done with 20%. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, I don't know, dude. It's just 40% is just built different as opposed to the other ones. You know what I'm saying? And I haven't talked about Super Ultimate Bahamut, because Super Ultimate Bahamut is literally everyone except one person gets you to 10, and then the last person just kills it. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, it's a very different dynamic when it comes to ending off of Hexa. And this is only 40%. I haven't even gotten to the rest. This is only 40%. So it's just like, I don't know. Hexa is just, it's built different, dude. It's crazy. There's just so much stuff that goes into this fight as opposed to the other ones. I feel it's very different. Okay, so next let's talk about, and this is gonna, at this point, well, I guess we can kind of talk about Super Ultimate Bahamut still too. We can talk about like post 50% of Super Ultimate Bahamut as opposed to just 10%, right? So the next thing after 40% on Hexa, right? Hexa will start to, essentially, it'll give you a turn, and then it'll do a trigger, right? Essentially, it can have, you know, this trigger, which is 40 times, then this trigger, then this trigger, right? It can have these 3 triggers that it just randomly throws out, which in my opinion is already above Fosson, because it's 1 above Fosson, right? It's 1 above in the amount, and I would say this is harder to do. 3 dispels is harder to do than Fosson's 2, right? So if you get this multiple turns in a row, this can be harder. And the thing about it, this too, that you have to think about is, if you fail this, if you fail this, you get this, right? You get this stuff right here, especially this faded chain cut. I'll come back to it in a second, but let's look at Fosson's, right? So Fosson, where the heck is his? Where's it show? Okay, so this one, if you failed the dispel one on fall, you get this, right? Which is it's okay. It's okay. But the thing about it too is this buff that he gets, you can dispel this buff afterwards. I think you could probably, can you clear this? Oh no, you can't even clear these. You can't even clear this. So if you lose this, you're stuck with this. You can't clear these. So you're taking this dot damage if you fail this. But the thing I was going to talk about is this faded chain cut is important, because the first thing, essentially, Hexa's HP can't go below 15% until you hit 15%, and then it's going to ask you to do a faded chain, right? If you don't have that faded chain, I don't know if you die or not, but I don't think you can go below 15%. I can't actually remember what happens if you just fail that faded chain part. But essentially, you want a faded chain go into 15% so that you can get his unchallenged off and you can continue the fight, right? So losing, pretty much all these triggers have the same thing, right? Where if you fail them, you lose 30% faded chain, which means you now have to take more turns post 40%, which is already hard, because remember, not only are these triggers decently hard, but you're still dealing with this crap. You're still dealing with these stacks. These stacks, unless you can get them completely gone based on how you played early in the raid, you're still dealing with this. So you're limited on the amount of turns you can take, and as you use skills, you are continuously taking 20k plane damage, every time you go up to 6 skills. So you can potentially be taking a lot of damage while you're trying to push that post 40%. Also, remember, the longer you took on the 6 Dragon Trial, you may have a ton of debilitating debuffs that you have to deal with. This is what I was saying, where it's like 40% to 0, it ain't no slouch. That's a decent amount of HP that you have to deal with all this stuff that has been built up in the first 60%. You know what I'm saying? So it's difficult, you know what I'm saying? And then it's like, I would say this one is probably kind of easy, but then you have this one too, where some Ellies may have issues doing 40 hits at just random times, because like I said, these 3 are random which one comes up. So you may have issues dealing with 40 hits, and not only does this one give you the faded chain, your butt gets paralyzed. If you get hit, you get paralyzed. And guess what? This paralyze lasts for 2.5 turns. And what did I say before when I started this phase? He does nothing for a turn, and then he does a trigger. So you're going to be paralyzed until, guess what? You have to deal another trigger as soon as you come out of that paralyzation. And it's just like, he beats you down. And again, this is from 40% to 15%. You have to deal with these 3 triggers if you're moving. So a thing to think about, back in the day, probably even to this day, people in Hexa straight up don't do post 40%. They'll clear their dragon trials, then they'll let like wind, water, earth, whatever Ellie push from 40 to 15, and then they'll just start playing again at 15% because they can't deal with this stuff. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like that stuff is rough. And then when you compare that, see, this is the type of thing where I say, Hexa or Fosson was way more boring to me than Hexa was, because you look at Fosson and it's like Fosson from I guess I would say probably around like probably around like 45-40%, somewhere around there. From there until 20%, you are essentially only dealing with these two triggers. These are the only two triggers that will come out. Once you finish your 55% gauntlet, he'll only do these two triggers until 20%, right? So it's just like, you look at these triggers in comparison, and it's like, he gets a buff that can be dispelled. Afterward, you can just dispel the buff, or you can like time skip with like Kame and just drop the buff off of him. You know, or you have to deal with like strong arm and blind. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, and these barely do any damage. And again, these, at this point, you don't have all the debuffs that Hexa has on you, and you're not dealing with the skill restrictions that Hexa has on you. So it's just like. Also, I guess False On, if you do cancel these during a turn, like before you actually take the turn, he could do that. He could do this to Sarah, where he could do 5 skills. But again, this isn't that bad. You know what I'm saying? It's not that bad. And I guess False On does have the end that's constantly ticking, but I feel like even that's not that bad either. Where it's just like, I don't know. I feel like the 40 to 45% to 20 is not as bad as 40% to 15 on Hexa. I just feel like it's not as bad. I feel like it's not as bad personally. Even when I've had to like carry that percent, I feel like it's not that bad. So I don't know. It's just like, but these, this is something, man. This is something, man. So okay, so let's get to, okay, so I did say I was going to mention some stuff about Super Ultimate Bahamut, right? So post 50%, Super Ultimate Bahamut can do, what is it, every 6 turns or something? He can do one of these 3 triggers, which can be kind of hard. I mean, I guess this one you kind of need Quillen for. This one can be hard or easy depending on the comp you're using, and then this one can also be hard or extremely easy depending on the comp you're using. Like this is like this is essentially just a Sheeking a Galleon S2, and this is done. So you know what I'm saying, it's not that bad. And then he is technically he can get this stuff. And I guess also another thing Super Ultimate Bahamut does have, Super Ultimate Bahamut actually kind of does this better than False On. Where Super Ultimate Bahamut, I guess he does technically have buffs that may persist post like the first phase, so after 50%, depending on what happened at the start of the fight, right? Depending on what happened at the start of the fight. But I don't know if these are really that bad either, I'm gonna be real. I think the worst part about these is whichever one gives you I think it's Purging Light, yeah. Whichever one gives you Zombification. Zombification, I feel like, is the biggest killer in Super Ultimate Bahamut. Way more than how much damage he's actually doing. Zombification is just, it's a ridiculously stupid debuff. It's dumb. It's dumb, and you can't remove that crap. Well, you can remove it, but sometimes it will get stuck behind other stuff, and then you can't remove it because there's not enough clears. You know what I'm saying? So I guess technically Super Ultimate Bahamut does have something that's close to Hex's Dragon Energy, but I would say this one is less. See, the thing about it is, I would say this one is less player focus as opposed to Hex's, because Super Ultimate Bahamut's, these triggers that give these buffs are random, as opposed to Hexa, where it's like that's dependent on how much damage you're doing, and then whether or not essentially you are proccing the trigger. You are proccing the trigger depending on what you're doing, and then you are canceling the trigger that you procced yourself. Whereas this one is just randomly choosing. You may never see Purging Light. You may only see the triggers that give these, and then you just cancel those triggers, and it's just like, okay, well, Super Ultimate Bahamut's easy. You know what I'm saying? But depending on, again, the randomness in Hexa, you may get more or less stacks of Dragon Energy. You know, just depending on how the fight goes. You know what I'm saying? And then how much damage you're able to do and not able to do. Because sometimes you may be able to move more in a fight and deal with more triggers. And then sometimes you might be able to deal with... You might not be able to move as much. And then be able to deal with less of the triggers. or fail triggers, and then you get like messed up. Also, oh god, I forgot to mention, if you fail the 2 mil hit triggers, bro, the 2 mil hit triggers, 2 mil hit triggers, we thought zombification was bad. Oh boy, you thought zombification was bad. If you fail a 2 mil hit trigger, pretty much 50% of each dragon's phase, so like all the 6 dragons at the start, before 40%, at 50% on the HP bar, they will do a 2 mil hit trigger, and you have to hit a certain amount of times, 2 mil hits a certain amount of times, right? If you fail that trigger, they will give you these jinxes that are permanent things, and essentially they make it so that jinx, those 2 Ellies that you failed on, are now on Ellie against you. And the thing about it is, if you're not playing like Earth and you don't have permanent water switch, Hexa throughout the fight will do post 40, they'll do all types of damage, right? So you're taking all types of damage. If you fail these triggers and every single Ellie is on Ellie, you're dead. You're getting bodied. You're gonna get blown up, dude. You're gonna get blown up, and it's just like, oh my lord, like, it's crazy. And I honestly can't think of anything. I can't think of any other trigger that messes you up that much if you fail it. If you fail it in the other 2 raids, that could potentially mess you up as much as that 2 mil hit trigger can, because that can be devastating for Ellies that don't have like a permanent switch, Ellie switch. It's just like, oh my god. And again, these are indefinite, so you have to deal with these throughout the entire rest of the fight. So if you fail 50% at the first phase, you're stuck with that jinx the rest of the fight, good buddy. So it's just like, oh my lord. Okay, so let me see. Okay, let's talk about 15% next. Okay, so 15%. So now I'm going to focus. I talked about Super Ultimate Bahamut's post 50 and the triggers he does and stuff there. Now I'm going to focus more on Fawcett versus Hexa, right? So I'm mostly going to be looking at 15% on Hexa versus 20% on Fa, right? So 15% again on Hexa, like I said before, when you hit 15%, you need to use a faded chain to get rid of the unchallenged, because you will not go below 15% unless you do that faded chain, right? So you have to do a faded chain there. After that, he will essentially do Fa Zero's. He'll do an advanced version of Fa Zero's 55% gauntlet. Remember, this is at 15%. This is when make or break on the fight, right? This is make or break on the fight. This is the very end of the fight. You now have to do 20 mil charge attack damage, 20 mil skill damage, land 10 debuffs, do 2 million damage 10 times in 1 turn, and then also do a faded chain at the very end before he inevitably wipes you at the end, right? All of these will happen just like Fall Zero's 55%. In quick succession, they will do it every turn. So you do this one, the next turn it's this one, the next turn it's this one, the next turn it's this one. You have to do them over and over and over again, right? Now let's look at Fa's, right? Let's look at Fa's. Now Fa, once you clear 20%, he only has, at 13%, he will have 99 mil damage, and at 6%, he will have 99 hits, right? He only has these 2. The only other trigger he has post 20% is if he has full diamonds, you have to do a faded chain, right? That's the trigger. He also, from what I know, besides the end, he does not have a hard wipe. He does not have a hard wipe besides just the end at this point. So if you start failing, obviously at some point you're gonna get to a point where you probably can't fade a chain anymore, and your end bar is gonna go down really freaking fast, right? So end is his end, right? But it's not like a hard wipe in the sense where Hexa, once you finish these set amount of turns, this point you're just done. That you can't do anything else past this turn. You're just done. Once you're finished with that. But as you can see, Fawcett has a lot less to do at the very end of the fight as opposed to Hexa. Like, this is what I said before, where the fact that Falson has this gauntlet type mechanic halfway through the fight, as opposed to Hexa, who has it in make or break, do or die at the very end of the fight, is a kind of a difficulty spike, in my opinion, as opposed, you know, between the rates. There's a kind of a difficulty spike there. You also have to remember, again, Hexa has the debuffs that you've been taking from the Dragon Trial, however many turns you took on the Dragon Trial. Hexa also has buffs depending on how much Dragon energy you had going up to this point. Hexa also has, depending on how much Dragon energy you have, you also still have the stipulation where you can only use 6 buttons, and then you get skill sealed and take 20k plane damage. You know what I'm saying? So you have to deal with this gauntlet at the very end after you've taken all this damage, you've dealt with all these mechanics, you've dealt with all this different stuff from Hexa. At the very end, you have to now deal with this gauntlet turn after turn after turn. And that, in my opinion, is pretty cheeky intense. I would also say I think his gauntlet is more difficult. Let me look at Falson's, right? So Falson has charge attack 5 times. Let's just say that's 20 mil charge damage, right? So that's the same thing. Then you have 6 times. I would say this one is I guess it's kind of equivalent to this, because I feel like, well, yeah, I would say it's probably kind of equivalent to that. It's probably equivalent to that, right? Then you have 35 million damage versus, well, okay, we'll go past them. 35 million damage as opposed to this. 35 million damage as opposed to this. Now this is something. I feel like 35 million damage is way easier to do than hitting at 2 million, specifically 2 million damage 10 times. Because you have to, the thing about 2 million damage is you have to hit it in one hit. It has to be one hit of 2 million damage or higher, right? So a lot of skills you'll see, like, you know, like for example, Cosmos' S1. Cosmos' S1 may do like 8 mil damage or something, right? But it was 8 hits of 1 million damage, right? So that doesn't count. That doesn't work like that. It has to specifically be 2 million hits, right? 2 million damage per hit. And when you think about this mechanic, again, this is at a point in the fight where you are potentially restricted to how many buttons you can press. So being able to hit this and having limited buttons is quite intensive, as opposed to something like just doing 35 million damage, right? Then, okay, we have 10 debuffs. We have 10 debuffs here. Again, this one, they're the same trigger. But again, you have a limited amount of buttons you can press to achieve these debuffs. Whereas here, you know, you can press whatever buttons you want to do your debuffs. You know what I'm saying? And then another thing I noticed while I was looking at this, if you fail any of these triggers, assuming you don't just outright die, it gives you permanent debuffs. Each one of these has a permanent debuff here that makes it even harder to continue with this gauntlet. There is nothing like that here. Granted, Falsons, if you fail them, you just die. But these have permanent ones that make it harder to continue through the gauntlet. You know what I'm saying? Which is, it's just like, and then you put these on top of all the other damage and beating you've taken getting to this point. That's quite intensive. It's quite intensive, right? And then at the very end of it, there's a Fated Chain trigger, which isn't too bad. You know, Falson has a Fated Chain trigger, right? But there's something very important about this Fated Chain trigger, okay? Remember, what did we do when we came into 15%? We had a Fated Chain trigger. So throughout all this, you have to now build up your Fated Chain again to do this. You know what I'm saying? So that's something to think about. You have to get your Fated Chain back up in order to cancel this final trigger. You know? And then Fall Zero does have the 60 hits. I think 60 hits is a pretty good trigger. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not even gonna cap on this one. I think this one's pretty good because 60 hits is pretty difficult for a lot of Ellies. You have to work around doing 60 hits on a lot of Ellies. You know, some Ellies like light, they get Sandolphin, and Sandolphin can just press S2 twice and it's like you win, right? But some Ellies you gotta swap your freaking Opus key, and then you gotta Ogie the turn before so that you can get the Opus key. You know, you gotta make sure you have some type of echo going in. 60 hits can be quite a bit for this, so I will say this is a pretty good trigger, right? And Hexa doesn't really have anything else. I mean, Hexus is just the raid wipe at the end. You know what I'm saying? So that's pretty good on Fallout Zeros. But again, you know, this gauntlet shows up at the end. The gauntlet can be taxing, because not only is the gauntlet just the requirements to do it taxing, but again, you're under all the stress of all the stuff you've taken so far, and you are potentially limited on the buttons that you can use to achieve the results you need. And it's all make or break, do or die. This is the last 15%. You have to do this or else you can't push anymore. You know what I'm saying? And there's a lot of times where you'll get to this point and it's just like you can't push. And again, another thing I really like about this fight with this 15% is, as opposed to, for one thing, because this is so restrictive, this final part is so restrictive, and every Ellie has had to essentially move up until this point, it is very hard to burst. Like, let's say, for example, let me see if it has. Okay, so yeah, Super Ultimate Bahamut, its 10% is 300 mil, right? And you have one person that just bursts this down freely. Hexa's has 900, 3 times more for 15%. It is much harder for someone to just by themselves burst this down when they potentially have to deal with all these different, you know, triggers going on. You know, it is much harder for someone to bring in something like a Trace Belger setup to try and burst down this 15% by themselves. So essentially what Hexa does is it forces, they essentially saw 10% in Super Ultimate Bahamut. They were like, one person is doing this? Oh heck no. The whole party's got to do this, bro. So in a way, you really feel inclined in Hexa that you really need to push. You really need to push in Hexa because everyone needs to do their part, because everyone's dealing with this gauntlet at the end, and we have to all as a team do this damage. That you don't get the same feeling in Super Ultimate Bahamut. You don't, I wouldn't even say you really get the same feeling in Fosson, because even though Fosson has more HP, I feel like it's just easier to move in Fosson, so it's not as difficult to be like, okay, I took all this damage here, I'm just gonna let somebody else do it. You know what I'm saying? Well, it's like in Fosson, I took all this damage getting to 20%, but all I really have to deal with is just, you know, use 000 to cancel out, you know, 99 mil, and then I just quill in 99 hits. And then besides that, all I had to do is Faded Chain every couple turns. You know what I'm saying? It's not too bad to move during that. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, it's kind of easier for this, as opposed to this where it really feels like it's a team effort. We have to try and push 15%. You know, obviously it's easier now that people have gotten a lot stronger. But when this fight first came out, it really felt, and this was the climax. This was the climax of the fight. It made it really epic feeling, you know? To be like, this is the end, this is the last 15%, and we all as a team have to push this, you know, so that we can beat the fight. It felt really cool. You know what I'm saying? Everyone was just doing as much as they could to do this. You know what I'm saying? It's just a different feeling. It's just a different feeling. So, yeah, I think that that pretty much wraps up my thought. I don't think there's anything else. I'm pretty sure I talked about how the shields are important too, where it's like you have to kind of deal with the shields as your Ellie, which can be very important again, you know, depending on where your Ellie comes out. Yeah, I mentioned this before because I talked about how light, you know, you may have an easy time dealing with Fediel and Luo, you know, later in the fight, but if it comes first, you know, you have to move because we need you to drop your shield. You know what I'm saying? But I think I pretty much covered what I wanted to talk about when it comes to Hexa. But all of that summarized, all that wrapped up, this is why I think Hexa, in my opinion, at this current point in time, is the best made fight in this game, because it really feels like they really did what they wanted to do with this fight. It feels like they really did what they wanted to do, and it feels like they went hard on it, and they obviously they weren't going to make it like super ridiculously hard, but they made it harder than I feel like the other fights are. It feels like more of a group effort than the other fights are, and it feels more epic. I like the, you know, I like the aesthetic, I like the music. It just feels cool. It's a cool fight in my opinion, and I feel like the design goes with the aesthetic and music presentation that it shows. I think the fight is very in depth, and there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's just very interesting. It's very interesting. I think it's very complex. It's just cool. It's just a very cool fight, and I think it's very well made. So yeah, that's just my rambling thoughts. I don't even know how long this video is, but I just really wanted to. I've been thinking about Hexa, and I'm just like, I wanted to talk about why I think Hexa is, in my opinion, the best fight. So hopefully that you know, that I don't even know what to say. Hopefully that explains my point good enough, I guess. So yeah, this video was very different. This wasn't very as much of an analytical video, you know, grids and, you know, summons and stuff like that. But, you know, I think this might be a pretty fun video too. So, hopefully I don't have an addendum, but we'll see once I get to editing. But anyway, thanks for watching as always. Thanks for the support, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. Okay, so there's a few things that I did want to add. So this is an addendum. One thing I wanted to talk about was Fosson. I said a couple times that Hexa was like one of the only fights that has like an instant wipe mechanic, like when it comes to, I mean, I guess technically it doesn't even really instant wipe you, it just like wipes your front line, but I mean, you're pretty much done at that point, especially going into Dragon Trial. But I said like Hexa was like the only fight that really had that. But Fosson does have that with its 55% stuff. Like if you fail any of these labors, like you just die. It's pretty much the same thing where it just completely wipes like your front line, right? So you're pretty much done with the fight at that point, and you're probably not. I will say though, the one thing about this that makes this even easier though, assuming you do, I just thought of this right off the cuff. If you do fail this, right? Technically the fight is not over, because if your Ellie ends up with a labor at 20% that doesn't really matter, they can still beat the fight without you. Because some of these labors, pretty much as long as you don't get the defense and debuff resist one, or the like double diamonds, pretty much people at this point can continue to push as long as you don't get either one of those. Now I will say, I've talked to Keiko, who I've mentioned a couple times on this channel. Keiko in my old crew Discord, we have a running theory that if you die early on in this fight, that you are more likely to get the debuff and defense one, or the charge diamond ones, because it happens so often where someone will die early in this fight and then they'll end up with that labor anyway. But it's not guaranteed though. It's just our fun theory. But yeah, so technically even these are, I would say, less important to, I mean, obviously you want to clear them, right? But they're less important than Hexa's 40%, where I feel like a Pearl is much more detrimental to the team as a whole, and it's much harder to beat Hexa with a Pearl up than it is to potentially have like the attack labor or something up in Fosson at the end, right? The other thing I forgot to mention was for Super Ultimate Bahamut, another big thing about him, I wouldn't say this is necessarily his big trigger, but 75% is also very strong. 75, this right here, the Daedalus Drive, this used to be like really big, like the 40k plane damage. Now not so much, and you can definitely just all sub this with someone and just sack a character. I would say the bigger thing about this nowadays is the strong arm, where you just can't heal for 6 turns. This is kind of bad. But yeah, yeah, those are 2 things that I forgot to mention. One thing I did forget to mention on Hexa too, this is kind of unrelated, but the 2 mil hit triggers. Not only are the 2 mil hit triggers, they will give you like the jinxes and stuff if you fail them, right? But the thing about the 2 mil hit triggers is, I mentioned, they go at 50% of each dragon phase, right? Well, remember, you're in a raid of 6 people. So depending on how fast these other dudes are pushing, you may not be prepped for that 2 mil hit when it comes. And if you're not prepped, you're getting a jinx. And if you get a jinx, you're probably screwed. So yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, that's another thing with Hexa. I'm not even gonna say bye this time. Well, I'll say bye just in case. Just in case, bye. But I don't know if this is gonna be the last addendum, but we'll see. Hopefully it is. Hopefully I don't think anything else. But yeah. Hopefully I don't. Okay, bye. Maybe.